Today's episode is going to be about the topic of rescuing or being a rescuer. And the reason why this topic came about was because I posted an Instagram reel yesterday about rescuing and specifically why to not rescue your children from problems. I actually recorded it, I don't know, like a month ago, maybe a little bit longer when we went up to LA and I just batch recorded a bunch of coda free reels that taught different principles of becoming coda free and which is the opposite of codependency or freedom from codependency. And so this principle, there's a lot behind it and why it matters in parenting and then also in recovery. So I wanted to start off just with like a basic understanding of what rescuing is. And so rescuing in this sense means taking someone out of a situation that's uncomfortable. So trying to save them from the discomfort of, especially when it's natural consequences of a choice that they made. Or sometimes not even. I mean, we can get into this in a minute, but even like just trying to rescue someone from their feelings of disappointment or discouragement or despair, loss, anything like that, grief, whatever, trying to, and really the intent, if you uncover it, the intent of a rescue, even when it's subconscious, and typically it is subconscious, is I need you to be okay so that I'm okay. Like I can't it's so unsettling for me to see you not okay and worry about what that's going to turn into that I need you to be okay so that I'm okay. I mean, that's at the root of it, a lot of it. And then also, we can talk about this in a minute. Dr. Amen, who I referenced in my stories when I got into a little more detail of why I shared about this, says his philosophy of why parents rescue and why he rescued as a younger parent is to feed your self-esteem, because when you save someone from a bad situation, it gives you a sense of self-esteem. But what it also does is it robs the other person of their self-esteem by fixing their own problems. So that's kind of like a just base level ground work for what rescuing is. But what is your experience as a recovering addict with rescuing?
Well, I think that early on in just childhood development,
Mm-hmm.
like I think that there were instances where I was kind of rescued. I was the youngest of six boys.
Yeah.
So naturally, my older brothers are going to like take care of me and kind of save me. And I was the baby of the family. So mom, like, maybe gave a little extra attention.
That's what I hear. That's what I hear about when you talk about your childhood is not even so much that your brothers were rescuing you, but that they complained about your mom or
Yeah,
your
like you
parent.
always are the
Yeah.
spoiled one. You
Yeah.
get what you want. You get away with everything. So, and there's some truth to that. Like,
Yeah.
let's be real. Um, but I think that so there was that component, and
Mhm.
I think what it did to me, or that was not great, was it gives you a sense of like, oh well, I'm different. I get a pass. I get let off the hook. Or if I go talk to someone, it's kind of like, hey, I'm different in this, and sorry, this or that. And you kind of get away with things, or you learn to get away with things, and maybe like everyone can do that to a degree, and some people are better than it at it than others, but eventually it catches up to you.
Yeah.
Like in adulthood, it kind of doesn't fly anymore. And I think maybe our brains, or my brain, would be like, well, that still applies and I can still do this. So I remember, especially in college, I
Yeah.
kind of like, now I'm on my own, I'm 100% independent. I'm going to these classes and courses, and there's responsibilities that are spelled out in a syllabus of here's what you got to do, here's the expectation, here's the deadlines. And then, I'm like not hitting these things, and going in and looking for like oh yeah, it's cool, you're different. Yes, you can get a hall pass on this and turn it in late or whatever. And I didn't get that. And so on that side, that was kind of the disservice that it does. Um, but then there were a lot of instances where I wasn't rescued, and my parents just let me figure things out on my own, and kind of not left me, but let me have the space to kind of work out different challenges.
Yeah, true.
So that was helpful.
Well, and I feel like from a codependency standpoint, there's two sides of this that I have played. And one is being the rescuer, where I felt like, oh, a good wife or a good partner jumps in and helps, right? You feel like you're being helpful. You feel like you are playing this really important role in some like desperate person's life where it's like they need extra help. Like you need me to ask you every day, like, hey, how's it going? How are you feeling today? How's your recovery? Like I thought I was being helpful, but really, if we were super honest about it and broke it down to its bottom layer, it was I needed to feel okay by you telling me everything was okay. And that's why I was checking in on you. It was really like, if we're being completely honest, a selfish motive of like, okay, part of me feeling secure and okay is getting an acknowledgement from Neil that he's okay today. And that's where the codependency comes in of like, you hold the key to my happiness and peace because if you're okay, then I'm okay. But if you're not okay, then I'm not okay. And I know that can be kind of complicated, but that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, and this happened in so many toxic relationships in my life where it was like, I kind of started to feel when I started to get into romantic relationships, there was this kind of sense of like, oh, when I'm with somebody and they complete me, then, we're a team, we're a unit. And when I get into trouble, they come in and save the day and they rescue me and then I feel loved. And you create this dependence, codependency with another person. And then when they're having a bad day or when they have their own stuff to deal with or when the relationship doesn't work out, feel like you're drowning. You feel like, "Oh my gosh, like my legs were cut out from underneath me." And I remember feeling that in some of my past like really serious relationships that were also seriously unhealthy where there was such deep codependency that was rooted in me needing to feel like someone else was taking care of me. I think a lot of girls, and probably men too, but for me, like I kind of started to grow into this person that needed someone else to be my other half. And that's such a unsustainable way to exist in life is to wait for someone else to complete you, to wait for someone else to come in and solve your problems and comfort you and tell you you're okay. And it's not that we shouldn't care about other people or comfort or help, but when you create a situation where someone else is the key to that, it complicates things in so many ways. So, I mean, we're going to get into it today, but I think that you brought up a good point when we were starting to talk about this before recording that rescuing is part of the drama triangle. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah. So a drama triangle base this is something that I learned in recovery
Hmm.
and that they talk about. And it's like a kind of a well-known concept if you look it up or study it. So if you think of a triangle and the points, each point of the triangle has a different component. So maybe at the top you've got like victim,
Yep.
and then at one, the bottom right side is like rescuer, and then the other point, the last point, is persecutor.
Yep.
And so there's three different roles. So the persecutor is just what it sounds like. You persecute somebody, you're like, hey, you're nothing, like whatever negative reaction or attack that you put on somebody as a persecutor, you play that role. And then victim, you're the victim. Like poor me, like I've been wronged. I'm the one who went through all of this and this shouldn't be happening and this is so unfair.
Yep.
And then the rescuer is just what you talked about, where it's like, hey, I'm going to come in, I'm going to fix it for us, I'm going to fix you, I'm going to fix all of this, it's going to be okay, I've got it. And it, which sounds like, well, yeah, what's so wrong with that, or what's bad about that? But I think where it comes into play in a negative way is, as the rescuer, you can get caught into these other roles trying to rescue somebody.
Mhm.
So I come in and I'm like, I'm going to rescue you. And then maybe you don't respond in a way that I don't like,
Yep.
or you respond in a way that I'm like, well, wait a minute, I'm trying to help you. Why aren't you accepting my help? Why aren't you, I paid your ticket,
Yep.
or I set up traffic school for you to get out of this ticket. Why didn't you go to traffic school?
Mhm. There's a
And
string attached.
yeah, there's something loaded, and then you become the persecutor, and it's like, well, that's why are you so foolish? Like, why did and then you and like, here I am trying to help you, like I've been wrong. Then you go into the victim mode, and then you do this circle thing
Mhm.
where you're going and you're just bouncing between victim, rescuer, persecutor, victim, persecutor, and it's back and forth, and you spin into a really negative place.
And rescuing almost always leads to resentment because in a rescue, you come in, you save the day, but then you have expectations where, like you said, I set this all up for you, paid for traffic school. Why didn't you show up? Versus helping someone with no strings attached. This is why, like, whenever you hear financial experts talk about lending someone money, lending family money, it's always a gift. It's never a loan because if you expect them to pay you back and they don't, then there's resentment and that can just completely ruin relationships. Where if you just give something as a gift with no strings attached, that's, one form of helping. But even with that, so I did a bunch of research as we prepared to do this podcast episode. And one of my favorite parenting books, probably my favorite parenting book of all time, is Christ Like Parenting by Dr. Glenn Latham. And he explains a situation similar to, kind of what we're talking about. And he talks about this mother of a drug addict. He says he was nearly 30 years old. For all intents and purposes, he was well beyond her sphere of influence. Still, she held out hope for him, as all such parents should. Unfortunately, as she stretched her hand out still, it always had money in it and it always got bitten. Her son rarely came home, but when he did, he was disheveled, sick, and broke. He would plead for help. Mom, I have no money. I need your help. I love you. You are my only hope. He assured her, this time I'm going to get my act together. I've learned my lesson, Mom. I promise. Please believe me. Please trust me. As he looked at her through pleading eyes, the mother cried. The boy cried. They cried together. They embraced. It was all so tender and touching as he prepared to put the touch on her. They held hands and visited. It was like old times. They had a bite to eat across the table. They talked and smiled. Hope for a better tomorrow gushed forth, eclipsing reality. Remember, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. The stage was repeatedly set for a double crime. He callously robbed her of her meager retirement reserves, and she tenderly, quote, mercifully, unquote, robbed him of the lessons he could only learn through natural consequences, the lessons he had to learn if there were ever to be any real hope at all for his recovery, a hope that grew ever dimmer with each tender, quote, merciful, unquote, selfless gesture. Parents in similar situations typically ask me, but what do I say? This is my child. What do I say? And so, what has been, I guess, your experience? I'm curious actually, because I feel like we've talked about this in the past on the podcast, off the podcast, with you observing your parents' relationship with your brother Steve, who died by suicide and was, kind of constantly riddled throughout his life, like his adolescent through adult life with drug addiction, and the many ways that your parents tried to help with good intentions. And how did you see that play out?
That was Yeah, yeah, you see I saw the the whole range of different efforts, and I gotta hand it to my parents, like, they, like, literally tried every possible thing they could think of from, you know, helping and being involved and paying for recovery and doing all of those
Mhm.
things to, like, tough love, like, "No, figure it out on your own," like, "No, you can't use our car. No, you can't," all of these different things, and it was just it's tough to watch that, and I've seen it in my family, in extended family, and in just various situations, and I think watching the progression, I think in just about every circumstance I can think of, it initially starts out and it's super well intended
Right, always.
as like, let's help you. Like, what do we got to do? What do we got to
Mhm.
do? Let's do anything and everything. You need to, like, let's get you, we'll go talk to your bishop and let's get you into rehab. Let's pay for that. you need money, let's get, let's square you up on all your bills, like let's pay off your people, let's, whatever. And then what happens is it just enables more of the same behavior and activity from the person struggling with addiction, to where it's
Right.
like they keep getting into trouble and then they bail them out again, and then they keep getting in trouble and they bail, and then so I think I saw a lot of that, and just the frustration that comes from that process. Um, and then kind of the tail end of that, after going through that process for years, then I think I started to see some more healthy type things of like boundaries being set up, and like, hey, we can set this up. You can stay here, but here are the terms. If you violate these terms, then you've got to go. Or whatever boundary is in place, and then sticking to those things. So it's really, really, I think it's easier said than done. But the
Yeah.
analogy that I heard from my sponsor, who's a drug addict, one of my sponsors that I had, was kind of this analogy of the family will chase the addict, and
Mhm.
will just chase him, and they'll chase him off of a cliff. Like they'll run after him and try and save him, and he'll keep running from them, and there's a cliff ahead, and they're like, ah, don't run. But once the family or the loved ones, they stop chasing the addict, then all of a sudden there's no one running after him. He kind of stops and looks around and is like, wait a minute, there's no one chasing me. And wait a minute, I'm almost running off of a cliff. And then the responsibility, the accountability all falls on them. And so they stop. In some instances, like that's the concept.
Well, that's what happened with us. I feel like
Yeah,
with,
100%.
with me chasing you for years with your addiction, and a lot of my attempts to be the rescuer were similar to something that I read in Al-Anon Works. This is such a good book if you have a loved one who's struggling with addiction. This is from a husband who is learning to detach with love. His wife was an alcoholic, and he said, I could not separate from her, leave her, or even leave her alone. Wasn't it my right, duty, and my obligation to stay by her, direct her, and guide her, otherwise known as trying to control her? I can recall thinking that the more I was able to quote protect unquote the alcoholic from the adversities of life, the better she would be able to cope and therefore not drink so much. Since as far as I could tell, most anything was capable of causing her to drink, I was thus trying to throw a shield around her and keep the whole world out. And I remember feeling this way a lot of times with like, okay, I got to be like really nice. I don't want to upset Neil. If I have to tell him something that might be upsetting, like I have to do it in a really careful way where I'm right there after so that he can't like mess up. And there were so many psychological ways that I was thinking that I was being helpful by trying to rescue you and trying to protect you when really like the addict is going to do what they want eventually. Like as soon as they're out of your sight to deal with pain because that is what addiction is pain management. It was one of the most like freeing things for me to learn that it wasn't personal, it was pain management. And so, but it always came when I tried to rescue you, when I tried to shield you, it always came with these expectations of like, okay, we made it all better for you. So now you're not going to hurt me, right? Like now you're not going to go do something that's going to hurt our marriage or our relationship, right? So it came with a lot of heavy expectations on you and your behavior when I was rescuing you.
Yeah. Oh,
And
absolutely. And I think for me that would drive the addiction, because I think
exactly.
it would be loaded, and I think I knew it,
Yeah.
and I knew the expectations were there, and then it felt like, okay, I'm being controlled, like this is like I'm being policed, and no one likes to feel that way, of
Mhm.
feeling like, oh man, I just, feel like a 14-year-old kid, and my mom's coming down on me, and so I think that drives a lot of resentment, and then that resentment drives the addiction. So
Yeah.
like, I mean, the underlying causes and conditions of most addictions are a lot of it, most of it, maybe even all of it, comes from either fears or resentments. And so then it just turns into a dance where you're just kind of going in circles, chasing your tail of like, someone's trying to rescue you. That's driving, frustration, resentment. So you're going to your addiction. then that hurts them, then they further try and control that, and then they further, persecute slash rescue, and then you get resentment, and it's just circle on and on and on.
Yeah. Well, I feel like too, this is I so relate to this. The rest of that story from the husband trying to control slash protect his alcoholic wife was I doubt if it ever occurred to me that at the time I was completely depriving my wife of her dignity. It is often said in Al Anon that people must be allowed the dignity to fail. I think that they must also be given the dignity to succeed. As long as I failed to detach, as long as I was always there trying to pick up the pieces, doing for her what she could do for herself, eliminating anything unpleasant from her path to help her avoid drinking, I stood in the way of her self esteem. I didn't give her the opportunity to do anything she might feel good about. I continued in this self righteous, martyr like fashion, imagining myself quite the hero. I didn't mean to be overly harsh about this. I didn't know any better, and I was doing the best I could. My intentions may have been impeccable at times, but my misplaced sense of responsibility was monumental. And I think that that is what we experienced when we were so enmeshed and entangled in codependency with your addiction was I was like, I'm dragging us to the bishop's office. I'm dragging us to these recovery meetings. I'm going to fix us. I'm going to fix this for you. And when I was in charge of your recovery and when you were checking in with me, like I was your sponsor, and we had all of those totally unhealthy things in our relationship, it was like it was my recovery for you instead of. And so I don't know, describe again what that was like when that turning point happened and how it felt for you.
Yeah. Well, I think, and while we were in that kind of dance, doing
Mhm.
doing that dance, I think from an addict standpoint, you were I was thinking like, well, I want to do what's right. And yeah, that sounds right. And yeah, I want to do this for you. And, you should be my number one responsibility. And I should do this for you. And I think that's true. Like that person is your focus. But the problem that I ran into is if it's not, it has to come from me. If I
Mhm.
try and do it for another person, it eventually just turns into resentment because I'm like, well, I don't want to do this, but I'm doing this for my wife. And so then she becomes the enemy. I turn her into the enemy and it drives it. And so we kept doing this. But I think the day that you came to me and just said, hey, whatever you do or don't do, whatever choice you make, 100% it's all you. Doing it in a loving way that was almost I could tell that you were freeing yourself.
Mhm.
That and I felt it. I knew it. I knew it wasn't just like a, backhanded comment of like, "Well, fine, just do what you want." It was like, "No, for real, it's all you." Um, then I felt suddenly the weight of responsibility and accountability 100%. Where it was like, "Whoa, this is on me. And what do I want to do?" Do I, okay, like I can't blame this on anybody else anymore. So what am I going to do? And then from there, it was like, okay, I'm doing the steps. I'm really going to do this for me because it's 100% on me.
Mhm. And when I've tried to help mentor, sponsor people who are married to or parents of addicts and they want so badly to stop the pain. They want to stop the pain for the addict, they want to stop the pain for themselves. The irony is just what you said, like when the person finally lets go, then they are able to actually hand the problem back to the addict who it should belong to in the first place. And then the addict can decide, like, do I want to live this way the rest of my life? Do I not? And sometimes people don't want to hear this a lot of times, but sometimes rock bottom is the best thing that could ever happen to somebody who's struggling with addiction. Because then it's like this big wake up moment of, oh my gosh, this is my life. This is where this all of this behavior has taken me. So if you keep rescuing someone over and over from feeling that weight and hitting that rock bottom, then they might have a hard time ever coming to grips with like what they're doing to themselves, what they're doing to their lives, what they're doing to their families. And honestly, like there's a part of me, this might sound really weird and twisted, but like when someone comes into a meeting and they're just like, I am at my rock bottom, there's a part of me that almost rejoices for them because I'm like, I then there's hope, then there's somewhere to go after that. You know, once you realize you're rock bottom, then there's nowhere to go but up. And so interestingly, when I shared this reel and I saw some people saying like, well, I need my kid to know that they can always call me and that I'll always be there for them. And I even had some people saying things well, that's, Jesus rescues us. Like, that's not how God works. And I'm like, mm, but does he? Is it a 24/7 hotline of, hey, Jesus, I'm in a bad situation. Bail me out right now. And does he just like instantly take us out of discomfort or hard situations? In my experience, that's not how it works. And a lot of times, the most loving thing that our Heavenly Father does for us is allows us to climb through the trenches of hard things, especially when they're hard things that hard situations we put ourselves in, because then we learn something from it, and he doesn't just instantly take us out of discomfort. If he did, then we wouldn't have to deal with much of anything in life. And then there would be no character development or growth.
Yeah. And that totally makes sense. I mean, I get what people are thinking. I think that if you think on the extreme end of like, well, if your 5-year-old kid runs out in the street, are you just not going to say, well, it's like, of
Of
course
course.
you're going to save them. Like if it's something that they're not at that level of emotional mental intelligence or understanding to where it's like they're not there yet, then yeah, you do need to be the brakes. You do need to come in and protect them in various ways. But I think when it's 100% reasonably in their capacity and in their jurisdiction and realm and responsibility to do something, like as an adult or even as, some various tasks as a growing child, that I think you do rob them of opportunities to learn and grow and to become self-sufficient by just doing everything for them. And that's coming from somebody who, in a lot of different ways, as the youngest child, like I just kind of became codependent in that way where I rode off of that. I was like, oh, cool. Like, my brothers will come in and help me and save me from the situation, or I'm getting bullied and like, hey, Dave, come help me out. And it's like, boom, he comes over and helps me. So that doesn't, you know, it comes from a unique perspective of seeing both sides of the coin. But I think that keeping in mind in a reasonable sense, like, yeah, obviously, if there are certain things where someone's not accountable or not responsible or whatever to the degree that they need to be to make an intelligent choice, then obviously you gotta help them and you gotta save them from various situations. So I get what they're saying, but at the same time, I think that that's missing the point of what you were saying.
Yeah. Well, back to Glenn Latham's Christ like parenting. I think this is such a fascinating point that he brings up when he talks about in Genesis, Adam and Eve made some choices and God did not save them from the consequences of those choices. He says, when Adam and Eve partook of the forbidden fruit, God didn't say, I've decided to give you another chance. Death seems kind of harsh for eating a piece of fruit. But parents do this all the time. They state their expectations, enumerate consequences, then protect their child from the natural consequences of their bad choices. That's a terrible thing to do to children. Children need to understand that behavior generates consequences. And then he says, learning to avoid being hurt in the future is learned best by the pain and discomfort caused by the carelessness. At such times, parental compassion and understanding should not, I repeat, should not get in the way of the lessons to be learned from natural consequences of a child's ill advised use of agency. To do so is to allow mercy to rob justice, and tragedy is sure to follow. And I think that every parent goes through that to a certain degree of like, oh, like you don't want your kid to hurt or you feel bad that something uncomfortable is happening for them. You want to make it better. And as parents, it does make you feel like, oh, this feels good that like I made it all better for them. But Glenn Latham's point, and actually the whole point of a book that you and I both love, Parenting with Love and Logic, is it does rob them of the ability to learn. And going back to Dr. Amen, if you want to go to his Instagram, he has lots and lots of reels. And actually, he just wrote a book. I really want to read it. He wrote a book with Foster Klein and Jim Fay from Parenting with Love and Logic. They just wrote a brand new parenting book all about this. It's like brain health combined with Parenting with Love and Logic. But his whole point was when you rescue kids from uncomfortable situations, you rob them of their ability to build self esteem that they can figure it out on their own.
Yeah. And I keep thinking of the example from the book, the parenting love with love and logic, where the kid forgets his coat on the way to school and he goes through the different options of like, oh, turn around and grab it, or kind of like having empathy and like, man, I'm sorry you forgot your coat. That's so frustrating. And I know it's kind of a, colder day or whatever. Um, I hope I hope you feel okay, and maybe next time we can make a different choice that's going to be more comfortable for you. And then obviously, again, with I think the point that the from what I remember from this book is like, one, it's got to be like a reasonable. If it's like 30 below outside, yeah, of course you're gonna
Put your kid
you
in
gotta get them a
danger,
coat. Like you're not gonna put them in danger. You're not gonna do something like cruel or
malicious.
abusive
Yeah.
or unusual. And I think that people's minds automatically want to jump there as soon as you start laying these concepts out. And then also it's got to be something that's like reasonably enforceable. It's like, okay, well, if this happens again, then you're never going to, go to school. We'll just not have you go to school at all, and like zero school for you. If you get, and it's like, okay, well, that's not realistic or
Or
reasonable.
now you have to
Or
figure out how to do that as the parent. Like,
the consequence has to be like a reasonably enforceable consequence.
right. Like if you say like, oh, if you do that, we're not going to go to Disneyland, and your kids know that you like booked the flights and the hotel and everything, and that's a family vacation that you've already paid for. Like,
That you're not
are you
willing
actually
to
going
dip
to,
out of. Yeah.
yeah,
You're not, and you've got to be able to stand up and be like,
like
okay,
back it
for
up?
real, we're actually
Yeah.
not going to go. And so, yeah, there is that component of being reasonable and being, to where you're not like abusive or totally, malicious in any way. Like it's got to be a consequence that's reasonable.
Well, and when I was observing and looking up, I mean, it's sickening to look up what happened with Ruby Frankie and the people that were commenting like this sounds like Ruby Frankie when I said if your kid calls you for something, don't just immediately run it down to the school for them. What's interesting about the things that they uncovered that were happening with Ruby Frankie is that they were mostly punishments and not natural consequences. And somebody got in my DMs and said, well, actually, what happened with Ruby Frankie was when her 6-year-old forgot their lunch, she called the teacher and said, don't allow her to eat anybody else's food. Like I want her to feel the pain of forgetting her lunch. And my point when I talked about this in stories was I brought up your very what's the word for it?
Everybody knows how big of a loser I am
No,
after.
stop. This is it's like it's
It's
pretty
so
smart.
funny. It's I don't it's like,
You
okay,
got
well,
scrappy. You got scrappy. So Neil decided what grade were you in?
this was in like 7th and 8th grade. So it's like probably 13, 12, 13, 14.
That you wanted to do what?
Like since I was a child, my brother and we talked about motocross bikes, like this Honda CR 125, which is a type of dirt bike. And that we were just obsessed. And so we kind of got the green light from my dad, which was a big deal. My brother totally worked that. And I wanted one. And like the only thing that I could think of to consistently get money to save for this thing was like if I and this like it's just almost embarrassing. Look,
It's
I'm like a
funny.
bum. Like I'm like begging for money at lunch and then saving my lunch money that my parents are giving me for this motorcycle. And so after, I don't know, a year or a couple of years or whatever, I had enough or most of it, and then my brother had like the other half, and so we went in on a bike together and we bought it.
Amazing.
Um,
But tell the
or
people,
you could do that, or you could just get a job.
yeah,
I
that
could
too.
have just got like, why don't you just get a job? I
Why don't
look
you
back,
like
I'm like, dude, why
mow
don't you
some
just
lawns?
go like get, go knock some doors and go see if people need gardening help? Like, I'm such
Okay,
a,
but anyway,
but I,
that's beside
okay.
the point. So, how did you survive during that year of cashing away your lunch money?
That, and this is the I just like begged for food. I literally would walk around and be like, "Hey, can I have a quarter at lunch?" And I would collect a bunch of quarters and I would get a cookie and a soda and I would eat that.
Oh, see, and I've heard from your
Or
friends
yeah,
a
in high
different
school
story.
sometimes I would be like, "Hey man, like I just kind of hang back and then at the end of the lunch period like people would be like, didn't eat something and I'm like, "Hey man, can I like are you done with that?" Like how I'm just like, why am I saying this on a public forum? Like this is so embarrassing.
It's funny. Well, the reason why I brought this up in my stories, and I know we've talked about it before on the podcast, so this isn't like a revelation. You've told the story before, but it's like kids are creative. They can get scrappy. They
You
can
can figure
figure
it out.
things
If you
out.
and my dad would say that. He'd always tell me, he's like, where there's a will, there's a way. And I like actually totally believe that. The things that I really wanted, I figured out how to do it.
Right.
Like if you really want something, you'll figure it out
Right.
and you'll get it. And so I see what you're saying, like you rob people or your children from those opportunities to learn, to grow, to figure it out.
To be like,
If you figure
oh,
it out for them and never give them the chance to.
yeah, like, yeah, that was uncomfortable. I forgot my lunch, but I mean, in most states, you can go through the cafeteria lunch line. And the concept of like you forgot your lunch was when I brought that up, I'm thinking like you had the opportunity to bring what you wanted to eat for lunch to school. You left it at home. So, go through the lunch line or maybe like ask a friend when they are about to throw away half their sandwich, like, hey, can I finish that or something? But yeah, then you give a kid the opportunity to be like, I figured it out. And I got this DM from a mom and she said, people's reaction to this video are wild. The internet is just crazy. Totally agree with you on letting them work through some hard, uncomfortable moments. My daughter decided not to do her science fair project in sixth grade. Had plenty of time. I reminded her about it. And when the time came, she submitted nothing. Nothing. The night before the due date, she lost her mind over it, was Googling 1 hour science fair project, crying to me for help, come, crying to me for help to come up with something, etc. Her teacher told me she was impressed with me for not saving her. So many of the projects were clearly done by parents anyway, and this was a lesson she needed to learn on her own. It was embarrassing for her to go to school empty handed, but she learned from it. And I feel like the really poignant times in my life where I can look back at my childhood and I felt like I really learned a lesson were the times when my parents were like, no, seriously, that's the consequence. And they didn't bail me out and they didn't change their mind and they didn't go like, oh, okay, well, like you worked some of it off or like, okay, that'd be kind of harsh. Like, let's go ahead and let you XYZ. Like, I still remember I was obsessed with figure skating and there was some kind of a figure skating thing that my parents had gotten tickets to and we were supposed to go to it. And then I don't know what the poor choice was. Maybe it was like I lied to them about something or I don't know. There was something and my parents were like, we're not going anymore. And I remember just like the regret and the pit in my stomach and how sad I felt that I was going to have to miss out on something that I'd really been looking forward to. And that really taught me a lesson with, now I can't remember what it was, but at the time I remember it being like, okay, I can never do that again. And so this is what parenting with love and logic, this is what they say about this. Some parents think that love means revolving their lives around their children. They are helicopter parents. They hover over and then rescue their children whenever trouble arises. They're forever running lunches, permission slips, band instruments, and homework assignments to school. They're always pulling their children out of jams. Not a day goes by when they're not protecting little Junior from something, usually from a growing experience he needs or deserves. As soon as their children send up an SOS flare, helicopter parents who are readily hovering nearby swoop in and shield the child from teachers, playmates, and other elements that appear hostile. Another thing that I've just observed, just being involved in the youth program in our church and a lot of teenagers and drama and like this is age old. Like girls are just a lot of times mean to each other when they're teenagers. They have drama. And what I've observed is the girls whose parents swoop in and get overly involved and they're calling other moms and they're right in the middle of all the drama, it typically just from my observation tends to exacerbate the problem. The girls whose parents are like, you'll figure it out, they do end up figuring it out usually. And, you know, typically karma comes around. Usually, like what goes around comes around. If someone is not being kind, it ends up playing out where, they have regret for their behavior or they end up, not liking the natural consequences of how they've treated someone or people who are kind typically like once people mature a little bit more and then everybody kind of figures out like oh we don't just need to be mean to each other to in order to like gain popularity, then those kids that were kind are respected and loved and they gain a lot. I was talking to one mom where I was like, why is your daughter so she is so kind to everyone. She is so stable in the way that she seems to deal with all these girls around her. She doesn't typically get like I've never seen this particular girl get involved in any kind of drama. And the mom was like, it's because she was treated poorly in our last neighborhood and the girls there were super mean to her. She didn't like the way that it felt and she said, I'm not going to treat anybody else like that. And so from natural consequences that were of no doing of her own, just, that's just kind of like what life dealt her in her last neighborhood. She learned from that and then was able to decide on her own, like, I'm never going to treat anybody that way. And this girl has just developed into someone who has true, really grounded self esteem and treats others with kindness and with respect. And I just wonder, like, if that mom had jumped in and like called the other girls' moms and tried to like fix that situation for her, would she have learned, oh, I like that feels like crap. I'm never going to treat someone that way. Or would she have learned, like, yeah, this is so unfair and people shouldn't treat me this way. And my mom got involved and those girls are just so awful. And I don't know. It's like, I think that a lot of the kids who end up being really grounded are those who learn to solve their own problems, figure out their own stuff. That's just the observation that I've made sitting back and kind of seeing the different dynamics that have gone on with these teenage kids.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I like that they say in the Parenting with Love and Logic book is like learning at a lower cost than,
Totally.
so when they're younger, they've got maybe like you forgot a lunch or you forgot your coat at school. Whereas when you get older, you're running into things of like, responsibilities of should I do drugs or not, or should I engage in these risky behaviors, or, does it matter if I get in this car with someone who's been drinking or not? Or
Mhm.
like,
The
some of
stakes are
these
so much
these
higher.
stakes just really get high, and then it's like the huge life threatening or, major issues that you run into, but learning them at a lower cost, so to speak, you being younger, then you avoid a lot of those really, really painful experiences once you're older.
Right. And the mom who wrote about her sixth grade daughter who didn't do her science fair project, I wrote her back and was like, what a beautiful lesson for you to gift to her to just feel and learn on her own that, had you rescued her from that, like how much longer would it have taken for her to maybe learn that lesson down the road? Like, is that going to happen when she's in college and she fails out of a semester of, an important class and then she has to pay to retake it? Or does it happen when she's in an early career and she just fails to prepare a presentation and then she loses her job because she shows up unprepared? Like, those are the things that eventually it does catch up to you if you've been like bailed out and rescued from hard situations. And so that is the point of like let kids learn hard lessons on their own and then also give them the opportunity to have the self-esteem to say like I figured that out or I earned that. And Nobody coerced me or made me do it. Nobody, you know, hurried and saved me. And so I would imagine that that girl that had that deep embarrassment in sixth grade isn't going to repeat that again. And probably, let's imagine like a few years later in high school, she's got a project. She's like, oh, I'm not going to feel that embarrassment again. She works really hard at it for a few weeks and then she goes and presents it. Like she's going to feel all of that self esteem of like, I did this. I remembered it. I was responsible. I mean, one thing I want to go back to also where you were saying like it depends on age, it depends on circumstances. Like, of course, if you have a child who has special needs, if you have a child who has like extreme dietary restrictions and they call you, they forgot their lunch and they can't eat from a kitchen at school where there's flour contamination because they have celiac disease, like, of course, you're going to run the food down to them. So, different circumstances. And that's how our Heavenly Father works with us too. Like, obviously, there are times when our Heavenly Father swoops in and saves us from something that could just be totally destructive for us. But a lot of times, when He knows that we can figure it out, He lets us figure it out.
Yeah. I just had this visual of like the gym. I used to go to the gym all the time, which
Mhm.
you have 5 kids, you kind of like, you don't anymore. I'm trying to get back into it. But yeah, like when we would do bench press, like in high school, we would do these days where you max, you just see how much weight you can lift. You can
Mhm.
bench press, and then you obviously have a spotter. So, in case you can't get the weight all the way up, this person lifts, helps you. But my buddies would, it was always a thing to just lifted barely enough to where the person was making positive progress and getting the bar up, but no more than that. And so they're struggling and but most of the weight is still on the person, maxing or doing the maximum amount of weight that they can bench press. And by doing that or by lifting that way, like your muscle growth is really way better than if you were by yourself and you just or if someone better yet in this example was just lifting it for you or making it super easy, it just you wouldn't get the growth. And so I think of that in a lot of these situations is like, yeah, you know, of course you don't want to just someone struggling, you're like, well, hopefully you figure it out, and then it drops on them and they injure themselves. Like that's not about doing that. Obviously that's not going to help anybody. But I think that the appropriate level, I think of people that worked with me or that mentored me but still allowed me to take the actions, to do the things that I needed to do to learn, to grow, but were more kind of consultant based in the way that they worked with me. And that was super helpful. And I think that that's how God a lot of times works with us is gives us the motivation through grace or information or revelation or ideas that come to mind, but action wise I still have to use my agency to
Mhm.
to take the actions and do and follow through. Once I feel the motivation, the grace, the revelation, whatever, it's still up to me to do the thing or do the things that I'm being counseled to do from God.
Yeah. Well, one last thing for me, as I was thinking about this, there's so many examples I feel like in the scriptures of the way that God does this with us, where He allows us to kind of pick our destiny. Like we believe in our church that there were two plans, that Satan had a plan of like, everybody goes down, makes all perfect decisions, they all come back and make it to heaven, and then I get the glory because I was the guy that made it happen.
And we force them
Yeah,
to do
exactly.
it.
Robots, right? And then Jesus came in and said, like, here am I, send me. And, I will go down and be the savior. Like, let people make their choices. And then I will die and also perform his atonement for all of our sins. And then the glory would all go to God. And so we believe that we chose Jesus's plan and came down to earth to receive a body and to have this physical mortal experience. And yet, while we have this experience, we had Jesus as this perfect savior, example, teacher, and he taught in parables. He taught us in stories. He taught us in these scriptures that we now have to reference, all about the nature of God and how he has expectations of us. But he also gives us agency and the ability to choose, good or bad, life or death. And in one of the parables that Jesus taught, the parable of the talents, he teaches about how, like, different people were handed different lots in life, like different um, measures of talents, different, some received more, some received, and they were all different in their nature and in the count and whatever. And that different people did different things with those amounts of talents. Some of them increased a little bit, some increased a lot, and then some just like buried them in the ground and didn't use them at all. And then they were able to reap what they sowed. And it says on here, for unto every one that hath shall be given, and he that shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he hath. And so, like, and then it goes on to say, like, cast ye the unprofitable servant out into outer darkness, there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And this is from Matthew 25, but there's also the, like, enter into the joy of thy Lord, like, you've been a good and faithful servant. So God allows us the opportunity to take whatever we've been given in life and then, choose on our own what we want to do with it, whether we want to develop our talents, help others. Ironically, I know we're talking about like rescuing, but just, doing good deeds versus like burying those things, not making good choices. And then he allows us to live with those choices. And so I look at, God being the perfect example of a perfect parent. And that's always to me, that's why I love Christ like parenting. That's always kind of the litmus test that I try to go back to is like, is this in the nature of God? Is this kind of how our Heavenly Father models for us, how we should parent? And so we try to do that with our kids. Like, here's your opportunities, these choices are going to lead to these consequences. These choices are going to lead to these consequences. It's up to you, and obviously, like, you don't give a 12-year-old car keys and say, like, here, do you feel like driving today? Like, you don't give kids things that they're not ready for, but in appropriate phases, we try to model our parenting off of what we've seen our Heavenly Father do. And it's, it, we're not perfect by any means, but I feel like when we model off of that behavior that, our Heavenly Father has laid out, it tends to go better than when we just try to figure it out ourselves.
Yeah. No, and I would have to, I totally agree with you, and I think leading with love, and I think if it comes from a place of love, then it's going to be executed in the right way and it's going to play out in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
If it's coming from a place of anger, probably not.
That's
Probably
the
then like
persecutor,
that's the persecutor, that's the abuser. That's where you get into
punishment.
the punishment
Mm-hmm.
abuse thing that I think, initially people jump to and they're like, well, wait a minute. But if it's coming from a place of love and choices and allowing somebody the opportunity to learn and grow. I think of our little kids that I swear right around the age of maybe what, 3 or 4
Or
with their, it's kind of like a let me do it, especially with shoes, like tying
why
shoes,
with the
putting
shoes? I know.
every time we go to put on our kids' shoes and I start to do it, they get mad. They're like, let me do it. But what does that tell you? Like that's innately in them of like, give me the opportunity. I
Mm-hmm.
want to learn. I want to learn to do things on my own. Like, don't rob me of that opportunity. And I think that principle holds true in all of us throughout our lives in various ways. And really at the core, we still are that kid that's like, let me do it.
Totally. And I mean, one last thing. Did you notice when Annie got that award at the piano recital, what the teacher said about the parents? Did you hear that? Like, she gave
She mentioned like, and this one, I can't, something to
she
the effect
gave
of,
Annie
and
Yeah.
she didn't have help from her parents.
Exactly. She gave Annie this, I think it was like a theory assignment or something, and then Annie won the award for it. So at the end of our piano teacher's recitals, at the end, she gives out all these different awards, awards for practicing, awards for theory, awards for learning your scales, different things. And I believe this was like a theory, like a music theory award that Annie had to study for. And she started saying like, the week before the recital, before her last lesson that would have qualified her for this award, like, Mom, I got to study. Mom, I need to study this. And I was like, okay, study. Like, if that's important to you, do it. And so the teacher, when she handed the award, and I've never heard her say this, we've been to several of her piano recitals, and she didn't say it about any of the other kids, but she handed Annie this award and said, and Annie earned this. And she was like, and the parents didn't help at all because every time, and for some people, that would be kind of embarrassing. For me, I was like, yeah, this was all Annie. Like, I didn't earn this. I earned none of this for her. Like, I didn't help her. And I love that she was able to fully collect on all of the self-esteem that came from like, yeah, I did it on my own. She said every time I came, to her lessons, she had to run up to her bedroom to get her study sheet because she was studying it on her own up in her bedroom. And so, we've made lots of parenting mistakes. We still do all the time. And we're always trying to learn. But that was a cool moment for me to be like, I'm so glad that Annie gets to capture that 100% all on her own, that she earned that she did the hard work. And it's so cool to see your kids just feel like, yeah, I did that. It was all me. Thanks so much for listening to Mint Arrow Messages. We're so grateful that you spent time with us today. Make sure you go follow us at Corinne Stocco or at Mint Arrow Messages on Instagram. And then if you have a second and you love the show, I would love it so much if you'd leave a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. That's the only way people can find out about us if they haven't heard about us before. So just go tap the stars, leave a rating or a review if you have a second. We would appreciate it so much.